Okay, so just to make sure that we have that message. And Professor Lorna Williams um, comes from Mount Currie, British Columbia. Dr. Lorna Williams is Professor Emerita of Indigenous Education, Curriculum and Instruction at the University of Victoria, and Canada Research Chair in Education and Logistics, where she designed and implemented bachelor's and master's degrees in Indigenous knowledge, in Indigenous language revitalization. Professor Lorna helped to develop the writing systems in Lilwat, I hope I pronounced it correctly, and co-authored the first curriculum and learning resources for teachers to teach the language in school. And these materials continue to be used to teach in school today. And one of the quote that Professor Lorna shared with me, and which which stayed with me for long, and I'm going to share this on the screen. It is that we know the power of education. It is power to destroy, and it's power to heal and thrive. We are still here because we continue to practice our powerful traditional forms of learning and teaching to be good contributing member of community. So with that, I am handing over to Professor Lorna Williams.
Thank you. Thank you, Mon. It's I looked at the names of the people who've joined, and I just want to say I'm very impressed, especially with the ones from Australia and Manila, Germany, who are, I know that the time is late and in the middle of the night. And I'm very happy to be with you today. And thank you very much for inviting me to tell these stories, because I think that in telling these stories, they're to those of you who are beginning in academia, those of you who are in academia, who are trying to change the systems of the inclusion of Indigenous people. It's I'm happy to be able to share my experiences. And so we'll begin with the PowerPoint, Amon. I prepared a PowerPoint, and that just gives me an outline, and also for those of you who want it and want to think about anything I've said, it'll help you. And so we called this session "Making Space for Indigenous Knowledge in the Academy," and because I think that that's the work that we all do as Indigenous people, and in any institution that we're in, but I think it's especially true in the area of education and places of learning. Okay, next slide. So kukstum we kalan we and shnuk wanos and shquachicha tilko litwat ula shwaash and shnuk تطلع آمش بينوش مش أقل بالجاونة كمخمن توال نشنك نوك يكوك بيا كل آلوي أبا شكيكا all the language champions and knowledge keepers present here and at home. Acknowledge the people and the ancestors on whose lands we gather today. Next slide. This is a word that I learned from a very good friend of mine who lives near here where I work. in the Sanchothan language. Everywhere I went in the world, I asked people, what is your word for learning and for teaching? And it was very interesting, the reactions that I got from people. And this is the word that a man named John Eliot gave me. And he said it's iltenicht in Sanchothan, to be a whole human being. So learning is about being a whole human being. It's holistic knowledge, and all knowledge is inseparable from the land, the place, the spirit, our languages, our relatives, from our laws, balance, harmony, and respect. And it's also a part of the spirit, the heart, the body, and thinking. It's all of these. We don't separate one from the other. And it's this ancestral knowingness, and that we've learned from our ancestors. Next slide. So el Tanihut. This is a word that I got from my friend Larry Emerson, in who lived in New Mexico, and he's Dine, the Navajo. He said their word would be ke, that understanding interdependent, compassionate relationships as they manifest in life. That it's a relationship between the earth and the sky, the self, the family, community, nation. It's a relationships with the animals and the plants, our ancestors and descendants. And so when you think about these two words, and I usually I add a few more from many other parts of the world, but I want you to think about, from your cultural world, from your Indigenous cultural world, what that word would be for learning and for teaching. And as you can see, it's about relationships, it's about connecting, it's about having a relationship with all of our relatives beyond our human relatives. And it also is it has to do with really with time, and that can't really be nailed down. You know, it's the connections with our ancestors, it's the remembering our descendants, that everything that we learn, that we do, and that we teach connects those two. Next slide. But as Indigenous peoples here in Canada, and I know in the United States, but all around the world, I've traveled to many places on this planet and met Indigenous people. And our history is really similar, in that we've had so many assaults and insults on our bodies, our spirits, minds, our family, our nations. And there are many. There is disease, and oftentimes diseases came even before the settlers came, and then took over our nations. In many places, there were forced separation policies, separating children from their parents, separating men from their families. And there was forced disconnection from our life on our lands. You know, I witnessed this and felt it, and felt the pain as I was growing up, as our world narrowed and we could no longer have our relationship with many parts of our territory. We saw, because we couldn't care for our land, we saw our plants suffering, and our plants could no longer care for us. We became voiceless, invisible, storyless, purposeless in the colonial world. Next slide. And in the Canadian and colonial context, and I looked at this in terms of what's happened to our languages, and what happened to our Indigenous language is the same throughout the world, and these are what we're needing to overcome and to address. And so it doesn't, so even though I say Canadian, it's beyond Canada. This is where I work and I live, and this is my context. But I just want to make sure that I point out that I know that many of you also live this. And one is that what has been put into place is an ideology of contempt, that there's a single story, there's a single language, and and I know that in your countries, just like I can in mine, trace the ways in which only one story is promoted in the education system, in the same with language. In Canada, even though we're supposedly a bilingual country, French and English, in the West here, it's the schools only operate in English. And even though there are French schools, it's and in Quebec and in different parts of the different provinces, French is the story and the language, and it's become standardized and promoted. It's funded, and it makes people. I could see this with Indigenous people, that it made them afraid that if their child learns my language, will it harm them? Will it keep them from learning and employment? And this has been this, in the more recent years, has become very, very painful. And it's become very painful because the need for learning language, when there's love and fear in the hearts and minds of parents, it's very challenging to overcome. And there's also the idea that there's only one knowledge system, and it's science, because science is true, and Euro-Western philosophy. And there's language social Darwinianism, the survival of the fittest, that only national languages are worthy and superior to all other languages. This idea that that is promoted is that only the certain languages that are chosen by usually a colonial government are the ones that survive. And they say, well, they survive because they're better, but it's because they're the only ones that are supported. And so it gives the idea that Indigenous languages are not that good, so they can't survive. And that English is a universal language, and this one is becoming much more prevalent because of technology, and it's the best tool for communication, and it's the most convenient. And that's been insidiously being put into place over the last few years. Standardization, the best way to revitalize a language is to choose one dialect and writing system, and promoting the idea that humans can't cope with variability. But how did our ancestors deal with variability in communication and language? And we have to ask ourselves that. And because when I was a child growing up in my village, and people visited from other communities, they spoke our language, and when we visited them, we spoke their language, and we were plurilingual. It wasn't We didn't only speak one language or one dialect. We knew all the dialects of our language. Next slide. So, how the world sees and then judges Indigenous people um, um, is that we're less than the so-called civilized colonial world. We're childlike when the way that they talk about us. We're unsophisticated, we're uncivilized, we're endangered, and this is a big one in all of the literature. It talks about us as being endangered, and so that it becomes accepted and acceptable, and that we're on the way out, and this has been the goal all along, and that we're marginalized. And still today, I was listening to the radio the other day, and there was a man talking, and we are still called hunter gatherers. It's and when you go into museums, we're always in that section of hunter gatherer. It's it's become a habit of practice to exclude us, to silence us, to separate us, and to promote our non-existence. And this is a habit of practice in all institutions. It happens in schools from K to 12. It happens in universities, in academia. And that when we're talked about only in one way. And then we're living and trying, when you look at what I said at the very beginning about the importance of relationships and connectivity, um, and then we are functioning, and we have to function in the Western world where they promote hierarchy in everything we do, and fragmentation, separation, the siloing, stratification, and status promotion. And the status promotion is one in which, when you look at the way that we grade, for example, um, you know, the best rises to the top, and so next slide, please. Next slide. Where are you, Mon? So the work that we do is a decolonization, to understand the effects of colonization, and all of us as Indigenous people this is the work that we're doing constantly. And so a part of decolonization is looking at ourselves, and we need to do this. We need to do this constantly, because we're in institutions where our minds have been colonized, and so we need to always to be unlearning, to be self-examining. Otherwise, we're carrying out for our own people colonization. Next slide, please. So I'm talking today about creating changes and learning in an academic institution. And I'm going to talk about there are many things that we have to do that many of you know about, but I'm going to talk about it in the context of creating a mandatory course in Indigenous teacher education a master's in counseling in Indigenous communities, degrees in Indigenous language revitalization, and my I think that where I'm going to spend a lot of time is the course on learning and teaching in an Indigenous world, because it's these series of courses was was to try to see how Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous ways of teaching and learning could be brought to a Western academic institution. And there are many challenges, and there are many things that we learned, and and I'm going to talk about leadership, the role of leadership, and research, the attitudes, institutional and government shifts that have to be made. Also, acknowledging community needs, to look at the Indigenous communities and what their needs are for the people who will play those teaching roles, and also the role and the between and between the relationships that need to be developed between Indigenous and non-Indigenous, and what their people and what their needs are for learning in these courses. The need for a multidisciplinarity, and because in the universities are so designed to be siloed, um, and to be single discipline, to be a single discipline to promote that. But our learning needs, and the needs to rebuild our communities, we need to cross disciplines. There are challenges in the institutions, in scheduling, in the habits that are in place, in the way in which we do things, our experiences, our ways of listening and observation. Next slide, please. So I covered a lot of this already. So on the left, but on the Indigenous community side, it's in the development and the design of the courses and the degrees. One of the things that we have to really consider is overcoming colonial history in our own heads and in our own communities, and also rebuilding our relationships, knowing that our relationships are of great value, and also overcoming our habits of wardship, because the governments are still consider us, because they consider us childlike, they think that they have to make every decision for us. But the other thing is that they have to make those decisions because they still know that they need to control us, in order to be able to do what they're doing to our lands, to our animals, to our fish, to our plants, and to all of our relationships. We need to be able to overcome distrust, and because in creating the relationships between ourselves, our community, and the Euro-Western Academy, because in the Euro-Western Academy, it's always been thought that they know best. It's the outside world that always knows best for what's good for us as Indigenous people. And we need to be able to shift that, and both within our minds as Indigenous people, but also in the world outside of our communities. Our communities are diverse and complex, and oftentimes, um, when people think about us, they think about us as being as one, and we need to be able to promote and to teach that we're diverse, and we have different languages, we have different cultural ways, we have different relationships with the land. There are many things that we share in common, I've learned, around the world, but we need to be able to also appreciate and value our diversity. Control and protection of knowledge. That is something that we have to constantly be challenging and overcoming. That on one side, our knowledge systems have been excluded, but on the other hand, we need to be able to protect our knowledge systems, our data, and so that they're not exploited and reimagined by others. Because so much of our knowledge systems have been interpreted, they've been translated, they've been anglicized. So sometimes when I look at the stories that our children are learning in school, those are stories that have been translated from the Anglo world, and so what we're doing is teaching a very different value system, and we need to be able to really take that into consideration. Next slide, please. So we need to shift constantly and between worlds, and one of the areas, for example, is when we have to remember and to realize and to respect and to honor that the indigenous world were oral worlds, that we had oral traditions, and it's only been in my community, um, the last 50 years that our language has become a written language. Prior to that, we learned our language, we communicated our language, we shared our language, we used our language in oral traditions. And we have to be able to build those oral traditions back into our lives. And another shift is that everything that we do as Indigenous people, at one of the greatest values is that we share, and that we share with one another, that we share with that everything in our world shares with us. And so that's been shifted to a world of hoarding and saving, and only and using only for the self. Communal relations to individualism is another thing that has been shifting in our worlds, and returning to the community and to the Indigenous world. Um, there are so many stories that I hear from young people who are making that journey back to their Indigenous world, to their relationships with their land. Although there are many people in the Indigenous communities the world over that have maintained those relationships, even though they've been a part of all the assaults that I've been talking about. Next slide. And uh, this is a quote that I use. I for much of my work, I've been to many Indigenous communities, in British Columbia and across Canada, in the United States, and different parts of the world, meeting with Indigenous people. And I was in a community in the northern part of our province, and this woman, Angelina Stump, she was saying, we're trying to put together a mirror shattered into a million pieces. And I also want to add that in this, that's the work we're doing for our languages, our knowledge systems, our relationships, our way of life. And so when we're putting it together, sometimes we might not know. We might put a piece in the wrong place, and but we have to take that into consideration, and to honor it, respect it, and to know that that the work that we're doing is complicated, And it needs all of us to be able to do this work. Next slide, please. And so bringing Indigenous knowledge and learning, with bringing that back together to relearn it is a real challenge. The other thing that I want to mention, that in many Indigenous communities, we live our way of life. We live our way of teaching and learning. And it hasn't been recorded by anybody. A lot of times we haven't had an opportunity to talk about it and to share it and to name it. We live it. And so um, so sometimes, it's sometimes we don't know how to name what we're doing. And this has been a really important learning experience for me. Next slide. So the message that that I always give to our Indigenous students in the courses that we've designed, is I tell them, bring your knowledge bag with you. And you have knowledge from your Indigenous world that is valuable, helpful, and relevant. Because for most students, when they end up at university, they've learned to leave their knowledge behind. When they open that door to the educational building, all their lives, when they entered school, they had to leave their knowledge behind them. They couldn't bring them into the classroom to use. And so part of the design of these courses, these degrees that I'm going to talk about, Indigenous students have to relearn how to be able to feel okay, to bring their knowledge with them. And they have lots of knowledge that oftentimes they don't even realize they have, that they bring with them from their traditions and their Indigenous worlds. And also I tell students, don't be afraid to ask your ancestors for help. And I know that in the academic and educational systems, we're not supposed to do this. But for us, our ancestors are still a part of who we are. And and they're present in our lives. And so we can't be afraid to ask them for help. And that knowledge, yes, much knowledge is found in books, and we're grateful for that. But not all knowledge is found in books, and it's not the only place. And I encourage our Indigenous students to go back to to their oral traditions and to the ways that they learned, um, and as a source for their knowledge quest. Next slide. So in the mandatory course, I'm going to begin with this one in Indigenous education. Um, I decided to join academia at a very late stage in my life. So it was the end of it was coming to I was coming to the end of my career, and I wanted to join a university in order to be able to see what I could do to change the way that teachers were prepared um, to learn about Indigenous people and to know how to work with Indigenous learners in classrooms. Because I worked in the K-12 system, and I know that that for all of the teachers coming through teacher education in Canada, they knew very little, very, very little about Indigenous people. and this had to change. And so I began with this idea of establishing a mandatory course, even though I was told that there were no mandatory courses in teacher education, or there were few that were established by the government, and which of course was not true. Um, and so I had to ask. So that was going to be a challenge. And so, what do teachers need to know about us, about Indigenous learners? How do we learn? And how do I unlearn? And I mentioned this already um, about unlearning, because for many teachers, they would need to unlearn what they had been taught about Indigenous people. And so, to set this up so that people can self-reflect, but in a safe and respectful way, is can be a challenge. And we had to be able to shift to the attitude of faculty, and the many of the faculty said that we already include First Nations education in our courses. So why should we have a mandatory course? Why should we have a course? And others asked, why should we have a course on Indigenous education? Why aren't we going to have a separate a course on other people's education? Um, and the two deans of education, the one at the University of Victoria and one at the University of British Columbia, um, were belonged to a group of deans of education in the province, and they initiated a task force on Indigenous education, and they asked um, Joanne Archibald from UBC, who has been long engaged in Indigenous education, and myself to co-chair the task force. And we looked at what is happening in the province. We did a survey of the province. We looked at the literature. We talked to all of the people who are currently in all of the universities, and uh, we did a report and a set of recommendations, and it was that helped the conversation um, to design this. And we engaged both the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Advanced Education to see what the challenges would be, to see what the needs were, to see what the policies were that were in place or not in place to make this happen. And we also met with the union, the BC Teachers Federation, and another organization that existed at the time that credentialed teachers. And we had a discussion with them. Okay, next slide. I'm running out of time here. I think I better. Next slide. And oh, go back one. I missed that one. Masters in Counseling for Indigenous Communities was the second, was another thing. I did other things, but this was another one that I think was really important. Um, there had been a master's in counseling um, at the university, and but when we looked at the people who were taking that counseling program, there were very few Indigenous people who were taking it, and yet we need counselors in our schools and institutions, and so we looked at the design of the course, and what was Indigenous about this master's program. That was the beginning. And then we met with the existing faculty. We brought together Indigenous healers, counselors, to discuss what should be in a master's degree and to prepare people. And we decided that it would be open to all students, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous. And but that we would have more Indigenous students in the program. And because we needed to be able to where there was such a need for Indigenous counselors, and we wanted to be able to make sure that that this was their program. We learned about Indigenous healing practices, the way that we kept healthy in traditionally. And we also learned about the counseling needs of Indigenous people in the current time. We need to review what counseling services are for Indigenous people, what the challenges are that face Indigenous communities, and what the experiences of Indigenous people have been in counseling programs. And we also engaged the Counseling Association of Canada. And, and this was a very important relationship. They had to learn, they had to be willing, because they're the ones who protect and promote their organization. And all of that, those conversations contributed to the design features for this degree. Next slide. And then in British Columbia, there's a huge need for um, for for um, for Indigenous language teachers and Indigenous language developers. And but there isn't any program that that our people can go to and to get a credential, to get a degree, and to learn what it is they need to know and what they need to learn to be able to do the work that they're doing. So often, our people go to university and then they have to unlearn what they've learned, and then they have to find elsewhere what they need in order to be able to do the work they need in their communities. And so this was a real need, and we engaged with First Nations communities to design the degree, and it was based on the needs of Indigenous language teachers in the community. It was based on knowing the status of languages, of Indigenous languages, and also the need to learn and relearn languages. And so involved in the degree were speaking, literacy, documenting, and programs for all ages. This was, we decided would be cohort based on one language, so that people could learn and relearn their languages. That it was a laddered program, meaning that it was laddered to be a certificate, a diploma, then a degree, and a professional teaching certificate. And this was designed this way because it's really important to realize that the people who are working on our languages are people who are also doing multiple tasks in a community. And they're also the ones oftentimes caring for their families. And and so sometimes they would have to leave a program, and we didn't want them to leave without having anything and that was recognized and tied to the work that, to what they had learned. And so it was laddered, and it was cohort based because so much of what I've seen in Indigenous communities is that the people working on language were often very isolated, and we needed to be able to mobilize a community, and this was a good way of being able to do that. And so the degree was designed to take place, to start out in the home community, language community, and then come to campus, because we have to change what happens on campuses, because the because remember what I was saying about our invisibility, and we needed to become visible on the campus. And there are many things, many resources available that can be used on campuses, and we needed to learn how to be able to do that. And so changes in both places, the community and the university, were important. Next slide, please. Oh, back, one back. Yeah. No, one ahead. Yeah, there. The next one was the master's degree. And the design of this degree, this was a challenge for the university, because I was engaging with the people who were going to be the users of the degree. And oftentimes at the university, degrees are designed very quietly, and and only become really known when they go to the Senate to be accepted. But we designed this degree by engaging the community language champions from across the province. We brought them together to learn what it is that they needed in order to be able to carry out their leadership roles of language reclamation, language revitalization, language maintenance, in and how to be able to deal with language diversity. We researched existing services and programs worldwide, and learned from what other people have been doing, and what they weren't able to do. We engaged again the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Advanced Education, and the Ministry of Reconciliation. We also had to engage and talk with the Dean of the Graduate School and the Deans of Linguistics, Education, Public Administration, and Early Childhood, because what the work that our people are doing in our communities requires them to know from all of these disciplines, and it can't just be one. And and this was a real challenge. It was difficult to do this at a university, to bring people together, because they're very protective. Each faculty is very protective of its students, and because that's how they keep themselves going. And so that was a challenge. Networking was really important, a design feature of this program, because for many students, as I was saying, they can't they don't learn from each other, and because they're usually working so hard in their places of work. And so networking is a really important feature of this degree. And early on, I was in my meetings with the dean of the graduate school, was to have spaces in the school for prior learning. And even though prior learning has been part of the conversations in universities, um, it was a big challenge to be able to build this in. And so I finally had to agree that it would be for 5 students and we would do it for 5 years. And so for students to enter without a formal bachelor's degree. And in order to be able to come to this, I had to do a survey of what it is our students, or not our students, our people, what our people do in their home villages when they're working on their language. And there are people who worked in on our languages their entire lives. They work, they do the work, and they've had to learn from wherever they could learn, because there's no existing program that helps them to do the work that they have to do. And um, and so their learning is really one that they structured. And so I documented this, and it helped to allay people's fears. And again, the degree was going to be both on campus and for very intense short periods, and then distance learning. And the reason for this is that our communities are small, and there are very few people at this time who are working on our languages, and we couldn't, and I just couldn't take them, to tell them to come to the university for 3 years to do a master's degree. That would be taking really the brains out of the communities and the energy for language. And so we had to design the degree in order to be able to protect the people who are doing the work, so that they can get an education, and the communities can continue to gain from what they had to do. And again, it's cohort based, because of this idea of networking. I wanted people to be able to share together, to be able to really create the friendships and the long-term relationships that they're going to need when they go back home. And next slide. And this was the best way to do that. In the final thing that I want to talk about is the teaching and learning in an Indigenous world. And I designed this course, and I think that it was lifelong, this design. And because in my involvement in education, I've been in trying to do this in all of my teaching. And so in my life, I knew that there were principles of teaching and learning from my world. And so um, I reached into my world to find what those were and to pull them out. And so I used the Indigenous principles of teaching and learning, which I'll talk about in a minute. There were 4 courses. Um, there are 4 courses that are based on these principles. Um, and in the courses, um, I brought instructors, people who knowledge keepers, people who really are our professors in our communities. I brought them on campus to be able to share their way of teaching, and because it's natural to them. They don't talk about it, they do it. And so I wanted them to be able to come on campus and to be able to do this. Um, the courses were made up of undergraduates, graduates, and this was a real challenge. This is not something that we generally do at universities. I invited faculty and staff. And the faculty, I invited them either to join me as instructors, or they could participate in the learning community. The community members, I invited community members from both the non-Indigenous community and the Indigenous community. And also involved were school age students. Because, and this is the reason I did this, is because these courses were going to be learning opportunities, and also that in our Indigenous world, we rarely ever separate ages in learning. And that part of the learning community is that people are helping one another, and we can learn from young people, um, just as they can learn from us. And and this was and I wanted this to be an experience for the participants. It was ungraded, because remember, I was talking about stratification and hierarchy and status. And so in our world, we don't do that. We don't even do a pass fail, really. But because I'm at a university, I had to compromise. And um, and so rather than grade, with 100% to failing, I just did a pass fail. And there were no books, even though books are important. They could bring books, but in the teaching, it was action based, it was behavior based, it was to do based. And there was also, we had to adjust time, the use of time, because sometimes in a learning situation, we can't do it between, between one time to another, and sometimes it went beyond the calendar time. We had to learning was working and learning together was in sharing, and being aware of the heart, mind, body, and spirit in learning were important parts of this program. Next slide. So these are the Lillooet principles. I'm not going to go over them. Um, just to say that these are from my language. Next slide. Next slide. Um, this the first course was the students um, um, carved this pole. And of the students, there was only one who had ever touched before any carving tool. So this was new to the entire group. And um, and out of this came stories. The log came to the on campus. It was raw, and this was important because the students began the work. I brought community members together to do the ceremonies, and and the university itself, the university community, became part of this experience. And the pole Shkalainen Sweka now sits in the education building. And um, and this too is there were a number of things that were a bit challenging about this, and one was that that there were ceremonies associated, and there were um, carvers, two master carvers. One was getting on in years, and a younger man who was just beginning. And this was a very important relationship, to watch how these two work together. The other is that one carver was from close to campus, for we were on their land, and the other carver was from up the island. And we had to bring those two worlds together, as well as the university world. So three worlds were coming together in the carving of this pole. And I guess the other thing is that many of the stories, and right away when they brought the pole to campus, it was male, and it had a male spirit. And And so it was really important, for us to honor and respect that in our world, we have male knowledge, we have male wisdom that needs to be honored and respected, and that it's a part of our world. Next slide. And the second course was on women's knowledge and wisdom, and it circled around the weaving and textiles and fabric arts, and from many nations, the nations here in the wool weaving, and the Métis Nation, um, the and also cedar, because cedar is a very important part of our world, and button blanket making, and cedar root weaving, and working with buckskin with different textiles, and so this too now hangs in the foyer of the education building. Next slide. Another one. This was the last one. Was story. It was called Story Stick. It's about how we learn from stories from our ancestors, stories from the land, stories from our dreams, our ceremonies, but also new stories that emerge from our experience. Next slide. And these are the students sharing their stories, and so the whole course was structured around story making. Next slide. So we had to uncover and recover knowledge and practice in the fields of study. We had to listen and to strive to understand the vision of Indigenous people for the area of study. And we had to be flexible to find alternatives to meet both needs. And I think I'm going to, the next slide, I'm going to see what, next slide. I think that it's important that when we're teaching and when we're learning and when we're in a learning community, that the learning has to make a difference for yourself, your family, your community. And that learning is for the community and for the self and responsibility. It's sharing, giving, and being responsible, not just for yourself but for others. And this was built into all of the courses, and I think in a very important part of learning. I know that for students this was really different, and the experience was so valuable to them. Next slide. Next slide. I just wanted, so the courses and the designs were based on research, and it's really important for us to realize that so much of what we had learned and what we needed for our communities, we couldn't find in current research. Next slide. So in making space, in policies, habits, practices, attitudes, making the shifts that are needed to include Indigenous knowledge, wisdom, and practice. And it requires leadership and protection for leadership. And it's really important. And I'm going to say this to you because of the group that I'm talking to, that new Indigenous scholars who are hired to create programs are vulnerable to advancement and scholarship, because doing this kind of work is makes you vulnerable. Making changes in institutions, because of fear, anger, hurt, um, because people don't like to change. And so oftentimes Indigenous scholars are the ones who are hired to do this work, and it makes them vulnerable for their own um, profession. And and I could do this because I was at the end of my career. I could challenge people. I could because if because I could be pushed out, and that would have been okay. And but it's asking young scholars to do the change work is very, very um, it's hard, because people are trying to advance themselves in their areas of study and for their families, and change work is extremely difficult. But at the same time, it's also very exhilarating to be able to see how our ways of teaching and learning can make strengthen people, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous. And I always say that at some point in everybody's life, they came from an Indigenous people. And so it's finding those back again and appreciating them and finding the beauty and the strength in that. Thank you very much. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Professor uh, Lorna Williams, for your this inspiring and wonderful, amazing presentation, as well as your vision, your courage, and your wisdom in creating this bachelor's and master's program and other programs that not only benefited one group of students or generations of students from many parts of the world will benefit and continue to benefit. In fact, your words touches my heart. I believe that from the response we see, some in the chat window also touches our many of our heart and nourishes our soul. Uh, I have seen some questions. I have many questions in my head, but I would like to open up for the audience for questions. And there are a couple of ways you can ask question. You can raise your hand using the blue hand, which is on the on the Zoom window. If you click on the participant, and then there is a window pops up on the side, and then you can raise hand. The other way is you can type in the chat window. And if possible, when you ask the question, I would love to have your video on, if possible. And so with that, I would like to open up for questions. And Romina has been patiently looking at the chat window. So Romina, if you have already any question, please feel free to share.
Thank you, Mom, and thank you so much, Professor Williams. Yes, Dr. Williams, and Professor, and expert in everything. So yes, there is a question on the chat about, they were wondering if there are any opportunities for community members on Vancouver Island to participate in these courses.
Yes, on Vancouver Island. In the well, if any of them attend the University of Victoria, yes. There are communities on Vancouver Island that are engaged in, for example, the bachelor's degree that takes place in their communities. The learning and teaching in an Indigenous world are, I don't think they're being offered anymore. at the university, or aspects of them are. But all the other ones, they're available for them, for anybody. And we have students from across the island and across Canada and from the United States who come to take courses in the master's degrees. Mhm.
Thank you very much.
For questions, please feel free to raise your hand through the Zoom, or in case if you are not technically cannot do it, just raise your hand on the Zoom window and we can call on you. So ask your question. And I'm so happy to see we have people from around the world, from Japan, from Hawaii, from Indonesia, and also from England, and from in North American countries also. So I have a question from Stanley Shakala, and next it will be Justin. Stanley, please feel free to ask your question, and if it's okay with you, you can unmute and also have the window.
Thank you so
video.
much.
Yes, please continue. Stanley,
Thank you
please
so much,
continue.
sir. Thank you so much, sir, for giving me this. Hello, are you
Hello.
hearing me?
I can hear
Are
you.
you getting me? Are you getting me, sir?
Yes.
Okay, because the network is slow here, it's bad. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to participate and indeed to listen to the very educative presentation by Professor Lorna. It has really inspired me. The first time I heard her presentation, it was during the International Year of Indigenous Languages in Paris, where she presented a very powerful presentation indeed. Coming to my question,
Stanley, we lost you.
that I have, I'd like to find out if you at all we can benefit, which I just mentioned. Because as far as languages, I'm very passionate about the indigenous languages, about local languages, about the language that are used by the community in where we stay. So we need more capacity building. We need more knowledge about it, so that I'm able to teach my learners. I'm able to teach my community. So my area of interest is to pursue further my masters and get PhD in indigenous languages. So may I know if at all there is any opportunity for people that are advocating for indigenous languages to pursue higher education, and if at all, what are some of the privileges that they can enjoy? Thank you so much.
I didn't quite, Mon, can you help me?
Yes, I will try. And I think it is Stanley is asking about the how about these programs, specifically indigenous language revitalization, and programs creating for bachelors and masters.
Mhm.
And what are some of the things that he can learn and take away?
Oh, okay. In the bachelor's degree, because it was designed, as I said, for that it would be cohort based in the community, taking place in the community. And the first 2 years are focused on language learning, on the indigenous language learning. because in our part of the world, our languages were in such decline, and so they were not being used anymore, other than in maybe in certain contexts, like in ceremonies. And so we needed to be able to increase the language usage. And so what has happened with that degree is that other people in the community joined those 2 years of learning their language. And one of the areas that we learned that was very valuable is that in the community, there are many people who speak the language, who spoke the language as children, as young people, and then stopped using the language. And so we call them silent speakers. And oftentimes, that group of people were the ones that, that were beaten in school for speaking their language. And so they were hesitant to speak their language. And so having a cohort in the community, remember I was telling you earlier that that one of the needs was to mobilize the community around language. And that's what having the courses in the home language community help to do that. And bringing the different people that in the community together. So young people, middle-aged people, old people, leaders, silent speakers, and bringing them all into a group mobilizes a community and gets a community working together for a common purpose. That's really important and key to language revitalization. And so that was a real value, I think, for people learning how to all the different strategies of teaching language, learning language, being able to share those, study those worldwide, what people are doing in different parts of the world are really also important. It gives strength to people. And it gives them the tools that they need in order to be able to do, to work on the language at all different levels.
Thank you. Next question is from Justin Wilson. Justin, can you please ask the question?
Good morning, Lorna.
Good morning.
First, I have to disclose that to Nina is often I get the opportunity to hear about your wonderful ancestral teachings and makes me understand more of what it means to be Lilwat. I don't really have a question per se, but I just have a story.
Where are you talking to us from?
Well, I'm on the unceded occupied lands of the Hunkleminum and Hulkaminum speaking peoples of Tsleil-Waututh and Skoltmash. This is our Gukwis house, or big house. Kind of reminds me of where I'm at. And as you can see, it's chilly this morning. It's a real pleasure. Lloyd has often told me wonderful stories, and I've often heard of your influence. And I just wanted to say, I'm learning the Haystuk language, and it's really intense. But there's something going on inside my body. In December, I learned how to say I love you to my mother. And I can't explain what that feels like. But I've been teaching in the Faculty of Aboriginal Studies at Langara College for 12 years now. I also teach at Capilano in Indigenous psychologies. But there's this embodied decolonization, emancipatory liberation where I feel my tlagimas, I feel my power. I'm just curious, how do you have any strategies for resilience about how we can bring post-secondary institutions more in alignment with the values that are embedded in our language that don't propagate capitalism and individualism, where it's all about taking. I don't know if that makes sense.
Mhm. Yeah, good. That's so that's what I was talking about, what I was trying to build into all of the courses and the degrees, because of the principles of how we learn and why we learn. And that can be built in. It takes it takes it takes partnerships between the First Nations, the Indigenous communities, and the learning, and the institution, and it needs to be built into the institution, and that's why I did the degrees, because and the mandatory course, because what often happens in institutions is that you do a change, but if it hasn't become a part of the institution, it just goes away. And so that's what happened to the learning and teaching in an Indigenous world. See, they weren't part of, they were, in a sense, my courses. And when there was nobody else to take them up, they just left. And so they have to be built in and into the institution. And that takes skill and time and courage to be able to do that.
Kookstum.
Mm. Meta.
Thank you. I can only imagine how much it felt to say "I love you" to my mom. So this is something that warms our heart, touches our heart. I think Romina says there could be question in the chat window. Romina, can you share?
Absolutely. Posting on the chat. So the following question, the next question says, some teacher educators believe that instead of offering a separate Indigenous education program, it should be integrated into the mainstream teacher education program. Professor Dr. Williams, what do you think about that?
The reason why I promoted having a separate Indigenous language and Indigenous education course is because at this time, because one of the shifts that we're making, remember I was saying that I talked about our invisibility and exclusion, and that is so deeply ingrained in everything we do, everything, in every institution in our lives. We have to shift that. And so maybe there'll be a time in the future when it can be a part of everything we do. But for the time when we're making the shifts of habit, it needs to be ground in. It needs to be a part of, rather than rather than thinking that it will happen. It doesn't. People forget. And then the other thing is that there might be an instructor that has a really good knowledge sense. So there might be an instructor that has studied, on their own usually, and knows how to incorporate Indigenous knowledge, but we're not at that time yet.
Thank you.
Any-
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, Monk, do you want, we have, I think, a couple of questions on the chat. Should I go on?
Yes, please.
Okay, great. So the next question is, how important is it to have Indigenous professors in the programs that you created? And what is the place for allies?
Well, that's a good question. Who asked that question? That's a really good
It is
question.
a former student of yours.
Oh,
Two.
I didn't hear it, but anyways, the role of Indigenous people in teaching the courses is really important, because as I was saying, so much of our ways of understanding, learning, and teaching in our worlds is not written yet in books, and so it comes from people's lived experiences. And so having, for example, the knowledge keepers from the communities involved in all of the courses that of the in learning and teaching in an Indigenous world, they practiced the teaching and learning in their world, and they didn't talk about it. And so it's really important to have professors, I think, who are knowledgeable, who know that world, because I was able to bring people in, engage them in a respectful way, because I know that world. And because we're shifting between two worlds all the time, you need professors who know how to do that, who know how to cross borders. What was the other part of that question? The last part?
What is the place for allies?
Allies. In everything I did that I talked about, I wouldn't have been able to do without allies. And knowing how to engage those allies, knowing how to work respectfully with those allies, and knowing, and this is a key, knowing how to protect those allies. Because what happens in institutions is when Indigenous people are brought in, they're breaching the wall. And so people collect to protect the wall. And so if you're Indigenous, you go beyond that wall, you've got in, and it can be really challenging. But if you're an ally, a non-Indigenous ally who's supporting in the Indigenous work, you can be seen as somebody who has turned sides. You're a turncoat. And so you can be treated very harshly because of that. And so, working with allies, knowing allies, protecting your partnership and your collaboration are really important considerations. Mhm.
Absolutely, yes. Thank you very much. I am also, that was me to think so much, but it's very good. Thank you. And then there's another question. Have you found that most Indigenous languages do not have pronouns, which enriched languages? So that's a language question.
Yes. The pronouns, we don't have all the pronouns that are found in English and French, and he, she, it, they, them. In my language, we have T. That's everybody, including animals and plants.
That says a lot about worldviews. Probably Mong has something to say about languages in world vision.
Right. I would like to ask a question, if I may, which is that about this language and the role of connecting multiple generations,
Mhm.
and also what I have found that there could be in our indigenous communities in the mountains of Hill Tracts and Bangladesh, these ceremonies are very important. And our elders participate and teach our younger generation and show the connection with the land and connection with the water. So I wonder if you could say a word about the role of ceremonies and also connecting multiple generations.
Mm. Um, those are extremely important. And as I was mentioning, that in all of everything that we do, ceremonies are a really important part of of our learning and teaching, and so we need to be able to build those in. It's part of community building, but it's also, remember I was saying that in our learning, it's where our minds, our spirits, our bodies, and our hearts are all really connected, and that's what ceremonies are about. It's bringing all of those together, and it's bringing community together, and it's bringing our awareness that we're not alone, that we're connected, and to our ancestors, and to all life that exists. And that's what ceremonies are helping us to understand. And learning across ages is really important, because one of the things that, for example, in my courses, I would tell the graduate students that their role is to support and to teach, and because that, in our world, that's always the way it was. You take responsibility for everybody, and for young people, and making sure that everybody is okay, included, and a part of the learning community. And so we all take an active role in that. And having the elders and the knowledge keepers, one of the things that the students had to learn was observation. Because when elders teach, they do. They tell stories, they do activities, and they're teaching, but they're not saying this is how you do it. It's up to everybody else to know how to watch and to learn from observation. And so it's really interesting, to include elders, and to ask them, and to open the way so that they can teach the way that they know how to teach, because that's very different from the way that we do it in schools.
Yes, thank you. And I see the hand from Sandy. Is it dancing water? Sandy, can you please ask your question?
Hi, Lorna. I'm coming to you from Sohwetm Ulu up in Williams Lake, so northern Sohwetm Ulu. I am a teacher at a high school, but I also do lots of passing of knowledge in our learning communities in a broader perspective. And I'm kind of struggling with something right now. And it's about knowledge mining. And I feel like, because we carry teachings as Indigenous people, And especially now, since we are doing these online platforms,
Mhm.
we're kind of viewed as a YouTube. And the knowledge that we carry is treated with an on-off switch. And I feel like, I don't know if you experience this, but I feel like often people are just mining me for information rather than developing that relationship.
Mhm.
And I don't know if it's colonization that has got my brain thinking this way, because I'd like to share the teachings. I share every day from the minute I wake up till the time I go to sleep. I'm sharing and passing knowledge, but sometimes it doesn't feel very good because it's like people just want to take so much. And I don't know what the question is, but what do you think about knowledge mining, maybe, or have you experienced that? It's a lot.
Yeah, it's mm, one of the things that we have to pay attention to is that the way that is so let's look at the Euro-Western school world that we all are a part of, right? How do they how do they acquire knowledge? They demand it. They ask, like, and it's given to them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. That's one. And then, or they go to a book and they learn about it, and they learn 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so somebody asks them, what do you know about this? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And okay, so you have to know that that's where people are. And so because they don't know about the indigenous ways, and they're and and because they're being asked to, that's how they ask and demand and expect it to be given. Here's this box of tools. There it is. And so it's really important for you to know that that's where it's from. And there's a word that you'll see in my slides. It's called kamuhkasha. Kamuhkasha. And I know that word, is that in all indigenous people have that concept, that idea of kamuhkasha. And kamuhkasha is when you think back, and I know that if you go into your community and your way of doing things, and this goes back to Mon's um, talk about ceremony. Kamuhkasha in my language, it means the energy that flows amongst people. And whenever people come together to solve a problem, to ask a question, to try to figure something out, to ceremony, to they don't just jump in the way that we've been taught to do in the Western world. We approach it, and so that so that we create a space where the energy is flowing amongst us. And that's when that energy is flowing amongst us that we can place and really challenging ideas and to shape it together. And so you have to know how to do that for people. So you have to calm them down, so that they're not just saying, tell me, tell me, tell me, and then you have to be able to, because they have to be able to feel it. And oftentimes they're not wanting to do that. They want it just all in their heads. And so it's a skill that you're going to have to learn and to figure out. Okay.
Thank you. I feel like that works really well. It's a skill I have. It's the electronic version of what we carry so deeply. And the electronic stuff comes in, and I find I often just have to tell them, can I call you? Because it's too much like
Mhm.
on the screen, you
Mm.
know? So that was, thank you. That was really helpful.
Okay.
Thank you, Sandy. We are a little over time, so I will
Yeah.
just ask one last question. Romina, if there is any one last question, we can go with. And then after that
So
question is answered, I will stop the recording and then we'll have little time to chat if you wish to. Yeah, thank you.
yes, okay, so there are two more questions on the chat and I am trying to put them together. They come from different places, but I believe they speak to one another, and it's about teachers concerned about their practices and professors. And is it, so one is about professors coming from the community, is that ideal cities? And the other one is about teachers, especially regarding languages, in places where they do not receive support for this kind of programs.
You are skipping out, and I couldn't quite hear.
Oh, can you hear me now?
I can hear
Yes,
you now.
yes.
Yeah.
Okay, well, so one of the questions was about professors coming from the community and if that is ideal for universities.
Mm.
And the other question is about what teachers can do without the resources that maybe in other places, in other universities they have, like financial resources or administrative, especially in languages.
Mm.
So maybe I should go again. Maybe it was too much all put together.
I just don't. I'm just missing some. I can't quite hear.
Okay,
Try it
so
again.
I will just read them. One is about, what do you think about teachers of Indigenous languages in secondary schools? What do you think they can do when they are not financially or academically supported, just to
Mm.
promote Indigenous knowledge?
You cut out again. What can secondary teachers do when they don't have resources?
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly. I just
yes,
posted it at the end of the chat
yes.
again.
Okay. Uh, Up until very recently, in here in British Columbia, teachers, Indigenous language teachers had zero support. And but teachers in our communities and have always found ways to be able to teach the language. And our languages continue because of those very people. And that's why it was really important for me to design a program and design degrees that would support them. And so we've also worked very hard to be able to to find the resources for our languages. And And so you can only do that by reaching out and finding people and to make it happen. But I want to say that the world over, Indigenous languages continue because people have been working on it, even though they might not have any resources to be able to do it, but they do it. That's what we've always done. And gradually, when people are gradually people do come around, and they do there are more people who come together to support the languages. But you're in a hard spot. You're in a spot where many Indigenous people have found themselves alone in trying to do the work. You're not alone.
Yes.
And just continue to do it, and by teaching even one person and touching the minds and the hearts of one person, maybe like they'll take up the work of it too.
Great. Thank you for these words of wisdom, for your kind words. And with that, I would like to end the recording. We are so blessed, and we are so fortunate to hear from you, to learn from your wisdom, and for this amazing and wonderful talk. And I also like to thank all the members from different parts of the world. I just learned Kenji's or others from Mongolia and other places joining. And so this also helps us to connect in this time, and then also learn from each other how the different communities are working to revitalize language, indigenous knowledge, indigenous ways of knowing. And Professor Lorna Williams, thank you for your time and for your kindness, for your generosity, for your vision, for your work, and sharing the story with us. We feel very grateful and blessed from the bottom of our heart. Thank you.
Thank you. Kukshtum kalap kika washapa.